Welcome back. You're watching Global Eye. The crucial U.S. midterm elections are set to take place on the 8th of November. All 435 seats in the House of Representatives, 35 out of 100 seats in the Senate will be decided, along with races for the post of Secretary of State, Attorney General and other state and territorial elections. Republicans have a clear edge in the midterm election. In fact, the Axios agency is reporting that former President Donald Trump is discussing announcing the launch of a 2024 presidential campaign on the 14th of November. This is in the backdrop of a strong showing by more than a dozen Trump-backed candidates in this election. Let's now go across to Wyne, senior analyst at the Eurasia Group. Ali, how will this election impact Joe Biden's foreign policy agenda?
Most likely Republicans will retake the House. There's a good chance that Republicans will retake the Senate as well. And if they do, it's not only President Biden's domestic policy agenda that will face difficulties, but also his foreign policy agenda. Right now, of course, we have deepening ideological acrimony in Washington. It makes it hard to pass legislation. It makes it hard to get initiatives stood up abroad. And I think that having said that, I think that there are some areas in which, regardless of the outcome of the midterms, we will see a fair bit of continuity. And I think, one area in particular is China. In Washington, folks don't agree on much, but there is a roughly bipartisan, maybe not consensus, but something approaching a bipartisan consensus in Washington that the United States needs to compete more aggressively with China, militarily, economically, technologically, diplomatically. So I think that regardless of which way the outcomes go, I think that the president's ambitions to push back against Chinese influence, I think that those initiatives will continue. I think that we will also see continued bipartisan support for strengthening America's relationship with India. That's also a bipartisan priority. I think one foreign policy area where we might begin to see some fissures will be on U.S. policy towards Ukraine. If you look at, for example, just within the Republican Party, differences between the likely, if Republicans retake the House, the likely next leader of the Republican House, Kevin McCarthy, and Senator McConnell. Senator McConnell has been very full-throatedly supportive of continuing support, military support, and other forms of support for Ukraine. Representative McCarthy has been a little bit more circumspect, and he said recently that the United States should not be writing more blank checks. So that divide could emerge over Ukraine, and I think that there's a growing weariness, I think, in Washington over how does this war end? The Russia-Ukraine war is now ending. It's now entering rather a much more escalatory, unpredictable phase. Okay. So I think that one foreign policy area where, entering into next year, depending on the midterms, where we might begin to see some cracks and some more difficulties for the president's agenda will be on continuing to support Ukraine.
Right. We have seen very close U.S. involvement in the Ukraine-Russia war so far. Do you think that post the 8th of November, there will be greater scrutiny in domestic politics about U.S. involvements, about Joe Biden's Ukraine plan? And would Joe Biden like to remain so involved post the 8th of November?
So the president has made clear, and the president's top national security officials have made clear that they regard the fight for Ukraine not only as a European problem, but really as a global problem. And they have framed Russia's invasion of Ukraine as really pitting autocracies versus democracies. You often hear President Biden come back to this narrative of democracies versus autocracies. So I think that the president and his top officials, they view the Russia-Ukraine war within a much wider global effort. They want to continue supporting Ukraine. They want to continue supporting Ukraine's ability to resist Russian aggression, but they also want to ensure that the United States doesn't find itself in a direct military confrontation with Russia that could potentially escalate to the nuclear level, which would be a horrifying scenario. So the president and his team, they have a very difficult balancing act. I do think that the president and his team would like to continue supporting Ukraine. They would like to continue supporting Europe's effort to diversify away from Russian energy. But again, they want to ensure that they cap escalatory potential for the Russia-Ukraine war. So a very difficult set of objectives. But I think that the president thus far has done a good job of balancing those objectives of ensuring that Ukraine can defend itself. We've been increasing our military assistance to Ukraine, but without entering into a direct armed confrontation with Russia.
All right. I would also like to ask you, do you expect the United States to go harder when it comes to sanctions on Iran and Russia post the midterm elections, and also countries which are trading with these countries or buying oil from these countries as of now?
I think we will see growing pressure. If you look at not only a growing pressure individually on Russia, sanctions pressure on Russia, and growing sanctions pressure on Iran, but I think that there's growing fear and growing apprehension and anxiety in Washington over a deepening relationship between Russia and Iran. And it's not only a deepening energy relationship; it's also a deepening military relationship. If you look at the drones if you look at the drones that Russia is using right now in Ukraine, increasingly those arms are coming from Iran. So the United States is increasingly concerned not only about Russian aggression in Ukraine, it's increasingly concerned about Iranian support for that aggression, increasingly concerned about this deepening relationship between Russia and Iran. So I think that we'll continue to see a growing sanctions pressure. The question is, what impact will those sanctions have individually on Russia and Iran and also on their partnership? There are some observers who feel that the more that the United States and the West more broadly sanctions Russia and Iran, the more that those sanctions, one, could actually drive Russia and Iran closer together, but could potentially have some boomerang effects. Keep in mind that right now, the United States, it doesn't, and no country for that matter, makes foreign policy decisions in a political vacuum. A lot of American consumers right now, they're worried about high energy prices, they're worried about persistent inflation, and there are a growing number of economists who think that 2023 could be a year of a global recession. And so if we do have a global recession, if we have persistent inflation, we may well face pressure from the American public, from Western publics more broadly to say, hey, we need to bring this war to an end. We need to make a renewed diplomatic push. But I would expect for the time being, the United States to up its sanctions pressure on Russia and Iran, although we've seen that Russia, even though those sanctions, I think that over the medium term and the long term, even though I think that those sanctions will begin to cut into Russia's growth outlook, what we've seen is that in the short term, Russia has been able to take advantage of high energy prices. It's been able to institute capital controls. It's been able to reroute its supplies of energy. And so what we find is that at least in the short term, not only have sanctions not deterred Vladimir Putin from proceeding further with his aggression, but Russia has actually been able to reroute energy supplies to China, to India, to others, and it's actually been able to increase its exports of oil and increase its oil revenue. And so that outcome is obviously concerning for the West.
All right. Thank you very much, Ali, for joining us. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Global Eye. News continues on CNBC TV 18. Stay tuned.